things that move us, that are important to us. Like philosopher Antonio Gramsci put it, writing from, I should say, a very difficult context himself, this is the time to put the optimism of the will before the despair of reason. And we applaud you for doing just that by being here. Today's session is titled Music as Action, Attributes of Excellence in Arts for Change. And the main themes of today's presentation will be agency and choice, which, if you think about it for a second, are critically important in a time where we're all navigating uncertain territory, realizing that these themes are taking different shapes. So now, I would like to introduce you all to our first presenter, Dr. Denny Palmer-Wolf, while she turns on her webcam. And Natalia, if you could help me prompting her to share her screen, that would be fantastic. Denny Palmer-Wolf is a principal researcher at Wolf Brown, which is one of the leading arts education researchers and evaluators in the United States. She holds a doctorate from Harvard, where she served as a researcher at Project Zero for more than a decade. Then she headed Harvard PACE, which is an initiative that links schools and external partners in new approaches to assessing student learning. There's a lot more that we could say about Denny, and I thought that in the interest of time, we could just share a link, which will be now posted in the chat box for anyone that's interested in learning more. Denny, we are very excited to be here with you. You have been muted, so let's make sure that we can hear you. There we go.
Yeah.
Hi.
Can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see the presentation. As you know, I will be here facilitating the session, so any questions that I see in the chat box, I'll bring to you right away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here, for giving us a portion of your morning, your evening, your afternoon. And a webinar is a strange form of human interaction, but it is an opportunity for all of us to be together and to invent new ways of being together. So I would like to start by talking about arts for change with an emphasis, exactly as Pedro said, on agency and choice. Just to get started, I would say that the work I've done all of my life is really about people's right to imagination. We all, as world citizens, are aware of the way in which we fight for people's access to clean water, or to literacy, or to the right to vote, or to practice the religion of their choice. But I want to add to that list and speak up or put a stake in the ground for people's right to imagination, to think about, to invent, to act on a world which is different from the one in which they immediately find themselves. And in particular, today we want to think about you as musicians, using music as one of the ways in which that can be made to happen. In particular, taking music beyond the red and gold world of the concert hall and making it a force in the world. In doing this work, I've been very much inspired by the work and the writing of Christopher Small, who talks about music as musicking, that is not the text or the performance or the critical review, but actually the heartland of it being the interaction between human beings. I won't read the whole quote that's here, but what he tries to get us to think about is actually that moment in which musicians and audiences come together at a particular time, at a particular place, and through a performance, speak to and exchange one another. So it's in that light that we want to think about music today as an experience which can bring to human beings that the sense of being able to imagine and to change their world. The second source for what I want to talk about today is a framework that was developed in the US, but draws on work from all around the world, which speaks to the arts as a force for change. And in particular says that when the arts, music, dance, theater, visual art, are used for fighting for social justice or making change in the world, we begin to see in those performances or those works an entirely different set of attributes. We see, and those are the ones that are sketched here on the screen. We begin to see features like the art's ability to build communal meaning, or the art's ability to disrupt the way we standardly do things. But this framework, which was developed by Americans for the Arts over the last decade, suggests that there were these attributes that arise when arts becomes a tool for social justice. But at the same time, the people who worked on this framework realized that as the world changed and as people put the framework together, different attributes would emerge. And in particular, what's emerged for us, all three speakers today, but increasingly as the COVID-19 crisis becomes a part of all of our lives, is a 12th attribute. And we think of that attribute as agency. In other words, the ways in which the arts give people a sense that they can act, that they can invent, that they can imagine. So this one day was walking in New York and saw this piece of graffiti wall art. And even though it's not a music example, I think it really speaks to what we want to say today. This young person saying, I paint, I draw, I conquer. The ways in which having the right to express yourself, to make your expression shared, can be a source of conquering the world. So it's at this point, Pedro, right, that we want to take a moment to reflect?
Yes. And I think actually if you come back 2 slides.
Come back?
Yes. Go back to the slide with the attributes.
Yeah.
There we go. So here we wanted to start with a question, which is, in your own work or work that you would like to pursue, which attributes from the ones that you're seeing on the slide would be the most important to measure to demonstrate your work's specific impact, whether this is through your organization if you're a music entrepreneur, or if you're a teaching artist through your teaching artist work. Again, the question is, in your own work, which attributes from the ones on the slide would be most important to measure to demonstrate your work's specific impact? And whenever you're ready, please post your answer in the chat box. We'll have about 35 seconds more to give you some time to think. Now, you don't know yet what each of these attributes or how this framework is thinking about all of these different attributes, but from an intuitive standpoint even, what are the attributes that you think would be most important to measure to demonstrate your work's impact? And thank you, Rachel. I start seeing responses. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Fantastic. And so what we wanted to do is identify one that has been mentioned a bunch. Let's take communal meaning. Should we, Danny? And what we want to do is show you what is get inside the framework for a minute, just so that you get an experience of it, so that you get to see what this framework actually looks like, in case you're interested in exploring this further after today's webinar. So I am going to start sharing my screen. And here. Now, this is the PDF, the actual framework. It's available for download using the link that I posted in the chat box. That's an introduction. And then here, we identified that communal meaning resonated with a lot of attendees in the call. So you would click on communal meaning, and this would take you to that section of the framework. And Denny, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to say regarding the layout of this framework, or anything that would help attendees make use of this framework after today's call.
Yeah, there are these 11, and we're going to argue today 12 attributes that people have seen in when the arts are used for change. The framework Pedro is sharing is interesting in that it gives not only definitions, but many lively examples. And if you go to the main website for the framework, you can see artists talking about them, you can see researchers talking about them, you can see policymakers, and then in particular relevant today, a colleague, Jeanette Rodriguez-Pineda, and I worked together to talk about it from a teaching artist's point of view. So what does it mean for a teaching artist to convey these kinds of attributes and to engage young people in thinking about them? You know, usually we think about timbre or rhythm or intonation as the heartland of teaching something like music. The argument here is just as much as those elements, we should be teaching young people about disruption, about communal meaning, those kinds of things. So it's an invitation to really rethink pedagogy, repertoire, concert design, everything.
Fantastic. And I'm making you presenter again so we can continue with.
Oh, okay, just one sec. Yeah, so there you have the framework. And as I said before, we're going to argue that there's a missing 12th, which is agency and choice, which is what we want to talk about today at some depth. Okay, so now Pedro, this one in the chat box or just for conversation?
Yes, so we cannot see your screen yet, but now I'm going
wait
to
a minute, sorry.
In
What's happened here? Ah, there, did it come through?
Not, yes, now we can see it.
Okay, great.
Perfect. And this leads to the next question, which is for you all. In one sentence, or even one word, as succinct as possible, what are we talking about when we talk about agency? What does it mean for a person to have agency? What does it mean for a student? What does it mean for a beneficiary of your organization? Just take a few seconds to think about this, and when you're ready, post your answer in the chat box.
And if I may, Pedro, I think in particular, why agency? Why does it matter in times like these? Okay,
so what is agency? What does it mean for a person to have agency, and why is it important today?
Yeah.
Great. And we're starting to see answers in the chat box. Hannah Dick says, it means having a choice, a voice, and say in the action. Catalina says choice. Kayla says agency allows artists to express themselves, connecting to others and the world through their art. Carolina says autonomy and drive to figure out solutions for problems and think in a different way. Basically, how can we reinvent? Myrdo says choice. Lindsay, power to choose or empowered to choose. Javier Bustos, liberty. Pam Corsa, feeling empowered and heard to contribute to decisions. Kayla, again, agency matters because it gives people power and the ability to connect on a more emotional level. Gustavo, how to express and find ways to reinvent at any time. And I'm reading this out loud not only because it helps bring this, but also to have this in the recording because they're excellent. Tamara, empowered with choice. Dorothy, I think agency is an aspect that ensures that one is oneself, that they can be. Now, thank you all for your responses. They're going to continue to appear, so thank you for your contributions. These are great, and we'll come back actually to them later in this session. But now from the responses, we get the sense that agency seems to be a complex theme to unpack, right? In relation to our work as educators and/or entrepreneurs in music. So we'll now have 3 brief presentations, 15-minute presentations, which will help us envision what boosting the agency, fostering the agency of our students and beneficiaries can look like in practice, and some of the outcomes that we can expect when we do this. So after these brief presentations, we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion at the end. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and I will bring them to the presenters. Jenny, back to you and to the world of the Lullaby project.
So, you know, the benefit, Pedro, of your reading them aloud, not only are they recorded, but as you were reading, I thought, oh, it's a perfect prayer for these days. So I think I may play it as I go to sleep at night, or don't go to sleep at night. So building on those very powerful ways in which all of you have described the agency, what we want to do now is to turn, exactly as Pedro said, to 3 examples of the way in which engaging people, young people and older people with music can be an occasion for building those participants' agency. So I will talk just briefly now about a project on which I have worked with many musicians in New York first, but now increasingly around the world. It's called the Lullaby Project, and it grows out of the fact that particularly in the United States, we have underinvested in the health of mothers and young children, and particularly in the US, as with all too many things, the quality of maternal infant care is disproportionately bad depending on who you are. So for poor families and for families of color and those who live in traditionally under-resourced neighborhoods, that first 1,000 days of life, which should be the centerpiece of celebration and of women and men becoming fathers and mothers, is often a very dangerous time with severe birth complications. So here in the US, twice as many Black babies die before their first birthday as children of any other ethnicity. So in New York, the question was, could music play its part in giving women who were becoming mothers a sense of their value and of their agency. Now, I want to be clear, the proposal wasn't that music could change the disproportionate nature of healthcare, but the question was, what could music contribute to bringing this to light and to making women feel more empowered to ask questions at all around childbirth and motherhood, to speak up for themselves, to ask for what they need, to ask for what their children need. So what we did was to work with mothers who were living in very stressful circumstances in New York, many of them living without permanent shelter, many of them single and very young, others incarcerated and separated from even their very young children. And in the project, what we did was to bring musicians together with women, sometimes with their children, sometimes separated from their children. And in a series of creative sessions, help them to write, reflect, and also to compose and perform a lullaby, which was designed to let them think about, express, and then perform their aspirations for their young children, and also for their aspirations for what and who they could be as mothers. So here you see just a quick list of the sessions, writing a letter to the baby, musicians and mothers talking together, writing the first draft of lyrics, rehearsing together, recording, making a dedication, releasing the song, and then having it both permanently in an iCloud setting so that it's always available, so it could be widely shared. And each one of these sessions was designed to put the mother in charge as an artist, as a capable person, as a person who could shape the future with her agency. This is just a quick slide. If you get them later, it's worth reading carefully, but it's a transcript of a musician, a violinist, Maz Smith, working with a young woman who was incarcerated and separated from her, who was incarcerated. She was pregnant and would eventually be separated from her child. But in red here, what you see is that the musician's role in this is at every moment along the way to endorse and support the mother's agency. So when the mom starts to talk about her dream, the musician writes down the dream so that they can turn it into lyrics. At the end, when they brainstorm the lyrics, and when Maz starts trying out melody lines, she says to the mom, "Stop me when you hear something you like." In other words, I'm experimenting on your behalf. You choose, you act, you shape. So that each of these sessions was in its tiniest detail designed to build the agency of moms at this very sensitive time. Just quickly, Pedro mentioned before, how would you show that what you were doing actually had the impact you hoped it would have? So we took the stories and the conversations and the song lyrics from moms and musicians, and we transcribed them and coded them and looked for the stories which were of mom's day-to-day life and the stories that mom told around the writing of the lullaby and what they hoped for the future. And you can see that in all of these categories, insights, achievement, life meaning, relationships, that the green line is what it was like, was the coding for narratives when moms spoke about their everyday lives. And the much larger red bars are indicative of how much richer their discussion, their stories, their narratives were when they thought about themselves and their children, what they could do, how they saw the future in the context of the Lullaby project. So you can see that even over what is often only 6 weeks or so, the change in mother's sense of who they are and what they can accomplish. This is just another diagram that shows how through the course of the Lullaby project, moms were moved to change their own social network, reaching out to other mothers, to their children, to their partners, to other family members, to create for themselves a social support network for these early childhood years. Just quickly, that was work we've been doing since 2011. We now find ourselves, hard to believe, but almost a decade later. And we've learned a huge amount from the moms and redesigned the project. It's almost twice as long. It's embedded in now in community settings, not just music settings, so health clinics or community centers. And absolutely every one of those sessions is focused on growth in a workshop format where mothers tell their stories and what's happened from week to week in their lives as parents and as women to one another. And they themselves are using their phones to make short films, which they show to each other in kind of micro film festivals in which they then narrate how they see themselves, their lives, and their children changing and growing, so that it has become almost sort of a triple dose of an emphasis on music and agency. And then here are just 3 resources that talk about the project and another similar one done with songwriting in the context of juvenile justice. The point being, though, that with respect to the Lullaby project, having a child should be a moment of great empowerment. It's often, at least in the US, a moment of disempowerment for women, and that we have found that through music, we can at least begin to return some of the sense of power, agency, and hope. So I can end there, Pedro.
Yes, there are a couple of questions for you before we
Great.
Thanks. Let me bring them to you. A couple are coming from Penny Brill. She works in the Pittsburgh Symphony, but also has a team that includes music therapists that have experience working with trauma. And she works in a shelter for Latin American unaccompanied minors. She has a couple of questions about this. One of them, what kind of training do the musicians have, and what kind of protections have them from trauma or being too affected?
So a couple of things. One, the musicians are working on music. And we've been very careful about the musicians not being music therapists. That's not their expertise. So the point of the lullaby sessions is a creative experience where people can experience themselves as agents and authors, songwriters, people who can raise questions, people who can speak and perform in public. But musicians are trained to be very respectful of the border between that and music therapy.
Mm-hmm. And she follows up with a question, which is, do they work with music therapists while keeping in consideration that boundary?
Yes, perhaps the place where that becomes clearest is in when the Lullaby Project has been placed in neonatal intensive care units, where there are both the musicians, there are the neonatal nurses, and there are the music therapists. And in that case, each one has a very specific role. With the neonatal nurses being clear about medical procedures and the rate at which babies are breathing and their heart rate and those kinds of things, being careful that the sessions don't go too long to exhaust, all of those kinds of decisions. The musicians offering a tranquil but creative space, and the music therapists working with families on issues of the ways in which the lullaby that was composed can be used in the process of negotiating stress, or in some cases, even the grief of loss. But that's a music therapist's business.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see the way the three are distinct and each very important parts, but different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And if you have a follow-up question, Penny, I think we will welcome it. If we don't have time now, we would have time at the end. Harvey Price, he's a fellow in our 2021 cohort, founder of an interfaith project in Israel called Peace Drums. He asks, do they, I'm assuming musicians, talk about civil engagement like voting with the beneficiaries of the program?
No, so it doesn't go as far as civic engagement explicitly. It has more to do with self-care, making time. So for instance, in Chicago, in a Lullaby Project, it ran in a house for young single mothers who had newborns or very young children. It was civic in the sense that when the project arrived there, bedtime was very chaotic. Children were up until 2 and 3 in the morning. And through the Lullaby Project, participants began to think about how much they, as adults, needed quiet time, tranquil time, time to write, time to reflect, that kind of thing. And the benefits of children having regular sleep patterns. So together, they used communal funds to buy several boomboxes that would allow them to play lullabies for children, and self-organized into a community that worked very hard on a regular day to night schedule for themselves and their children. So is that voting? No. But is it taking charge of your life and the shared social agreements. Absolutely.
Great. And I see that Tiffany Ortiz, she works with you
Oh, Tiffany.
on the Lullaby project, and she expanded a little bit on your answer, saying that social workers, healthcare staff, and other community staff play an important role in supporting these musical collaborations and in supporting the musicians. And staff also offers professional development as a support network for artists. Other international partners sometimes choose to integrate music therapists in their projects. Denny, thank you so much for leading this first third of the presentation. I would welcome you to either keep your webcam on or turn it off. But at this point, I would like us to move to a completely different context to continue exploring the same theme, agency. I would like us to fly to Kabul, Afghanistan, the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. And I would like to welcome Janiel Beh, to please turn on your webcam. And Natalia, if you could allow her to share her screen, that would be fantastic. Just a little bit about Janiel. Janiel is head of piano faculty at the Afghanistan National Institute of Music and a member of the 2021 cohort of the Glow Leaders program. Janiel leads some of the most inspiring work we have come to know, and her experience to us is a powerful example of several of the attributes that we saw on that slide at the beginning of the presentation. But here today, she will explore two. She will explore risk-taking and the 12th that we are adding in this session, agency. Janiel, thanks so much for joining us. We can see, give me 1 second. We can see your webcam, but now I'll make you presenter so we can see your screen.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet. Now we can.
Okay.
Now we can.
Yes. Okay.
Great. Welcome.
All right. So thank you for having me. And I'm really glad to be able to connect with all of you in this space during this really challenging times for all of us around the world. This would be my third year working at the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. And I just wanted to give a brief summary about what we do and how we started off. So in 2010, an Afghan musicologist started this institute. And he started this institute for street working children and for kids who are usually not attending schools or do not have the opportunity to go to schools, including girls. And so how we conceived of this music project is really with the conviction that Afghanistan has its own rich musical heritage, and that must be revived in light of the post-Taliban times, and that must be preserved going on into the future. So what we exist to do is to assure the musical rights of Afghan children and youth, and also of musicians who had to flee the country during the war times, and who came back after the Taliban was no longer in power back in 2001. And what we do in the school is to create a safe space for Afghan children and youth to come together through music from different ethnicities, from different parts of the country, some from the faraway mountainous regions of Nuristan, where schools are hard to come by and where girls cannot go to school very easily. And so we work with some local orphanages and including larger organizations like Save the Children, so that such students and such kids can have the opportunity to learn music and to also be part of the academic program that our school offers. Another thing that we do is to focus on promoting girls' education and gender equality. And as you probably know from hearing the news and from what you have read so far about Afghanistan, the rights of women are really in jeopardy. And even now, we are still facing a lot of difficulties in that area in order to break the taboo of music making, not only for boys, even for boys as well, as much as it is difficult for girls to do music. And part of my job and my work there is to also train emerging music educators. That means those who graduate from grade 14 in our school and who are interested to teach music and to continue in a pathway of music. One of the jobs of the teachers like myself there is to train them so that they can eventually take my place. So that's the really rewarding part of my work there, is that we are aiming for it to be sustainable, even though these students will be the first generation of musicians and music educators in the country. And finally, our work exists to lead cultural diplomacy for Afghanistan and between Afghans and the international community. So some of the stories that I will share in a bit will reflect all of these things. And I hope that it inspires you and also shows you that really anything is possible if we have the will to go for it. So one of the large ensembles that we created earlier last year was the Afghanistan National Symphony Orchestra. And the other large ensemble that we have is the Zora All-Female Orchestra. And these two ensembles I want to highlight because we have been doing some significant work through these ensembles that have been highlighted on the Afghan media channels and that have been the face of our school and also the face to the international community. So as an example of risk-taking, part of one of the attributes that Danny was highlighting altogether, including agency, including cultural integrity, I'd like to kind of like bring it all together in this presentation from the examples that I will give. So we had a gala concert last year, which we have every year, to showcase the work of our students and of our institute. And what was significant about last year's gala concert in risk-taking through music and through creativity is that we brought together musicians from different parts of the country, Herat, Badakhshan, Mazar-e-Sharif, a few of these places, and all of these places have different musical traditions. And so we brought musicians together to perform in a kind of concert medley. And it was really significant because the theme of that concert was inter-Afghan reconciliation through music. And in the past and even now, there have been a lot of conflicts between tribes and between ethnic groups, distrust, and all of these things. And so often in our school, you would find that there are children from these different tribes who normally wouldn't talk to each other or wouldn't get the chance to know each other. But in this space, they can. And it's a sort of neutral space where they can make music together and slowly, you know, get to know each other because those barriers and those prejudices come down. Specifically in this concert, it was kind of risky because the entire concert was filmed by the RTA, the Radio Television Afghanistan, and it was going to be broadcasted live on the YouTube and also on various media channels. So for that reason, I say that we were taking a risk because we were presenting a message that music is not just for entertainment. And in Afghanistan, the taboo behind music is that it's entertainment for really bad or haram purposes. And so what we were presenting as a message, as an institute, was that music can be used to bring people together and to foster reconciliation and connection and dialogue between people who, you know, normally may not trust each other or may not talk to each other. So that was a really important concept that we had last year. And this year, we were planning to have a concert last month, but unfortunately it was canceled in light of the coronavirus. And this year's concert was going to be about women and the contribution of Afghan women to the music and arts and culture scene of the country. So many people may not picture that as a thing, but really Afghanistan does have that kind of musical history and background. It's just that it's been covered over by 40 years of war and by, the religious dogma and all of these traditions and things that have silenced it and have just covered it over, so nobody knows that it's there. So what we wanted to do this year was to highlight key Afghan musicians or singers who are women, and also to include arrangements of Western female composers into our National Symphony Orchestra and our Zora Orchestra ensembles. And I want to highlight right now just a snippet from one of my students in the Zora Orchestra. Her name is Mina, and she is a beautiful cello player as well as a dilruba player. So the dilruba is an Afghan instrument, as you can see in the bottom right side of the picture. And in that picture, we were actually in London last year, in Oxford, for a music collaboration there and on tour. And our students got to share their Afghan instruments with the students over there in London that we were collaborating with. And that was just a really beautiful picture of how our students can realize their sense of identity through music and be proud of it and take ownership of it and realize that it's something so beautiful and so rare that they bring to the world. So Mina says in this short interview snippet is that when she learned about music, she learned the real way of music when she came to our school, unlike what many in the country think, because many people in Afghanistan think that music is bad or associated with bad or immoral practices. And for Mina, she realized that music was something that kept her going through the hard times, and it's something that nobody can take out of her once it's in there. And in talking about agency and in our students realizing that they have this power, this potential inside of creativity, that is something when you awaken in someone, especially in a place like this, where many people around you are not awakened to it, where your family members will stop you from playing an instrument, where right now during this corona situation, many of our students don't have instruments at home, unfortunately, because it's dangerous for them to have instruments at home. Yet music that they have experienced is in there, and they can still go on creating in their mind. They can still go on composing or singing something to express themselves. So for us, that is what we mean by agency, and developing that in our students. Another short profile I want to highlight is a girl named Negin, who is one of my piano students. She's now graduated from the school, and she was also the first conductor, female conductor in Afghanistan and for our Zora ensemble. She says this, she shares the story of how the school went on a music tour to the US back in 2013, and they actually had a concert in Carnegie Hall, the entire ensemble. And she said that when they were there and they were communicating with the musicians there, many people told them that, when we think of Afghanistan, we just think about the war and about Taliban and about guns and all of that. But when these guys made friends through music, and when they, played together and spent all that time getting to know each other, when it was time to go, it was really sad for them. And what McGinn is saying here is that these friends, their minds were changed about us because we showed them the beautiful side of our country. Again, in talking about agency, one of the most important things I see that we do is that we enable students to realize that they are cultural ambassadors of their country. And for these young women, they are ambassadors for their fellow young women all across the country who may still not have the chance to go to school, who may not have the opportunity, the right to study, and the right to refuse not to get married at a certain age, and usually at a young age. So this is the thing that we're talking about raising up this young generation, using music as one of the tools and instruments to help them realize their rights as a human being, as a young person, as a young woman, and yeah, even as an Afghan, their right to play their musical instruments based on the rich cultural heritage that they have, that many of their fellow Afghans do not know exist due to, the situations of the past decade. Finally, I just want to mention our current situation briefly, and you may have questions after this. I will be glad to answer if we have time. We have been in a really, really, really tough situation, and we cannot continue teaching because we're on lockdown, and we literally cannot continue teaching because many of our students don't have devices at home, and they don't have internet or reliable internet or even electricity. So I was trying to have a lesson with one of my piano students who the school lent a digital piano to. And when we just began the lesson, the electricity went off. And so we weren't able to continue. And these are some of the troubles that we face right now, though we are exploring options for using Google Classroom or some of these things where we could put materials up online so the students who have internet or who have internet for a short time, they can access some of these things. And the first thing that we tried to do was to distribute instruments to the students because they don't usually take their instruments home. So they had to get permission for those who were able to have an instrument home and to practice at home. And if it wasn't going to be a danger for them to do that. And one of the really cool things that we are managing to do is to get some of those students who do have internet or an older brother or someone who has a phone to record them playing an Afghan piece, and they have been sending that through, and we have been posting that on the page. So I know that music is very much alive and well in their hearts, and they can't wait to get back to learning and playing. And in the midst of the larger situation of insecurity and of the threats of the virus spilling in over from Iran, I know that we shall prevail with our students continuing to be creative even in their homes, and even after this, actually, for more to come out from their hearts to the community and to their families. And my hope is that during this time, they will be able to share with their families and their brothers and sisters what music really means to them, even now as they can't, not all of them can play music. So thank you for having me, and yeah, that was all I wanted to share.
Janelle, thank you so much for sharing about your work. The more we hear about it, the more we admire you for the work that you're leading. There is one question coming from Harvey Price, and he says, you mentioned that the Afghanistan National Institute of Music aims to celebrate the music of different regions of Afghanistan in an attempt to work towards cultural integrity. He wonders if this has ever meant conflict, meaning, do you find that the music of each tribe to be a source of conflict?
as in the songs or the traditions itself to be a conflict with other tribes? You can clarify that.
And perhaps, Harvey, since you know how to work this technology, if you could turn on your webcam and ask yourself, that would be great. Hi, Harvey.
Hi, Harvey.
1 second.
You need to unmute yourself.
I need to unmute him. There we go. Now you can unmute yourself. Perfect.
Hey, Janelle. So, is there specific music for specific tribes? And is there a conflict in them playing music together?
Oh, I mean, yeah, like people may be proud of who they are and what they represent. And we did have some conflicts during that concert between the musicians, because some wanted to be up the front and others were annoyed that they were put at the back if they were doing collaborations in that small way. So there's pride. Not necessarily the thing itself, creating conflict, the music itself.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, you know my feeling about why I use steel drums and not, a value neutral instrument. So,
yeah,
but I just wondering, like, no, we can't play that song that belongs to these guys, and we can't play that song because that belongs to those guys.
Yeah, that's why. Well, I think it's an interesting thing that our school has both the Western instruments, the Western classical, as well as the Afghan instruments. And I think what we try to do with that is for people to see that Afghan instruments, even among Afghans, there are different tribes that play certain instruments. But then when we brought in the Western instruments in the scene of the orchestra and how we all need each other in the orchestra, and that it's not one is better than the other. I think it slowly brings changes in people's minds that they all need each other, and coming together can be really beautiful, though it may be troublesome or difficult at first, because people may think that they're better, but when they hear the arrangements and they hear how it affects Afghans. So the mind of the Afghan society in general has changed a lot in the last 5 to 8 years, and they are so moved by it. Yeah, when they see such things happen.
Harvey, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye. I want to be mindful of time. There is one really important message in the chat box from Rukema. She says, I came to my country too. It's still something hidden. Music is still something hidden, not really open to everyone due to some cultural barriers, mostly to the young ladies. So thank you for your presentation. And there's a comment for you, Janelle, to explore from Penny Brill. Computer Rich in Pittsburgh, which refurbishes computers and donates them internationally, struggling to install and make sure they work. And there's an email that you can contact after. And Rukima says that she's from Rwanda. Rachel, she's an alumnus of Rwanda. She says that this is amazing and that she would like a copy of her PowerPoint. Yes, we will make available the slides via email to everyone that has attended. And one last question from Kayla.
And I'll add a contact as well.
Yes, sure. Sorry, what was that, Janelle?
Oh, I'll add a contact as well to the slide. Okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Kayla asks, is there typically family support for these young women musicians, or do they have conflicts at home because of creating music in the school?
Yes, so for most of our students, there is some kind of conflict or restriction up to a certain age. So, so far in our 10 years, we've only had 2 female students graduate on the classical sitar, Indian/Afghan sitar, and they graduated grade 14, and they got scholarship to study in India right now. But apart from that, no one else has ever graduated beyond grade 14. So many of the girls will be stopped from continuing when they're around 15, 16. And yeah, we have some unfortunate stories with that. But then those who stay in an orphanage may have the chance to continue longer because their families are far away in a province or village area, and they don't get stopped so easily because of that situation. But yeah, then they'll be living in an orphanage.
Mm-hmm. Janiel, thank you so much. I would love to ask a million more questions, but let's save some time for discussion at the end. And
Sure.
now, last but not least, Julie Hilbos, please join us. I will share a little bit about your background, but if you could turn on your webcam in the meantime. And Gosha, if you could make her presenter so that she can share her screen, that would be great. Dr. Julie Hilbos is the Creative Education Director of for the Community Engagement Lab of Vermont. She also works with From the Top in Boston and Wolf Brown, the same arts and culture research firm in which Denny works. She is in the faculty of the Longy School of Music of Bard College and is a soprano. She holds a PhD in urban education from the City University of New York Graduate Center and a master's in music in vocal performance from the New England Conservatory. She was also a master teaching artist for Lincoln Center Education in New York City for over 10 years. Judy, we are very excited to connect you with this group. We can see just a black screen. If you need help, I can share your presentation from my own screen, but let's see if it works from your own.
Let's see. Do you see it now?
Give me 1 second. I am making you presenter again, so there's going to be a pop-up on your screen now. Now we can see it. Great.
Okay, let's do, and it's full screen now?
No, now it's all black.
Oh gosh, sorry.
That's okay. Would you rather have me?
Sure, why don't you go ahead, Pedro, and I'll just mention when to advance, if that's okay.
That is perfectly okay.
I'm not sure why. But it's wonderful to be here with all of you during these very strange times, and to just continue our conversation about agency, and in particular how we as musicians and as teaching artists create environments that really foster or nurture agency in our students and in the work that we do. And I'm so grateful to Denny and Janiel for describing these two incredible programs that are really sort of exemplars that help women across in all parts of the world experience that kind of agency. But if you advance, Pedro, please, for this last perspective this afternoon, I was thinking that it might be useful to sort of focus the microscope in on the small moments of teaching practice that really make up the bulk of our days as teaching artists, and these tiny details of our practice that we repeat daily and weekly and monthly, and that those tiny building blocks are really the pieces that link together to create a robust program like the ones that we've heard about. So next slide. Choice is something that many of you responded with right away when Denny first introduced the idea of agency. So the first aspect that I'd like to highlight is just this, and it made me, thinking about choice really made me think about when I was a beginning teaching artist. One of the wisest things that a colleague, an older, more experienced colleague, said to me was, if you look back over all of your lesson plans and identify every single place where students get to make choices that matter, really authentic choices, this is the key. And I really took that advice to heart and have found that it continues to guide my practice. But it brings up this question of choice, because there are all kinds of choices, right? But all choices are not necessarily created equal. So it begs the question, what do we mean by an authentic choice, or a choice that really matters? So I tried to imagine a pretty simple example that would apply to many of us working in musicians who might be, leading a rehearsal or an ensemble of some kind. And I'm gonna give two different examples that we can use the chat box to talk about a little bit. So one choice that I've heard teaching artists use a lot is imagining that you're in a rehearsal and you're doing a warm-up before you dig into some repertoire. And the teaching artist might say something like, should we play the D scale or the C scale as a warm-up? And there's a vote, and then whichever one is selected gets played. Now, that's a choice, and the impulse is really right on, just to kind of wake up the students, to get everyone to engage and be in the moment. And it's not a terrible thing to do, it's a fine thing to do, and many of us will continue to do things like that a lot. But it's, on the scale of choices, maybe not a super significant choice. So to just get us to be mindful in terms of the kinds of choices that we're asking for students. So I wanted to just compare that for a moment, and to the next kind of a choice, which is that a teaching artist might say something like this: we're about to play the D scale to warm up, because we're going to play the Dvorak, right, which is in the key of D. So if you could think for a minute about how you feel about the character of the Dvorak, and could I hear a few words from all of you that tell me what you're thinking? So you might hear a few words that describe, and the teaching artist might say, okay, well, of those words that we just heard, could anyone think now of a way that we could play the D scale together, but that captures the feeling of that word, those words, whatever they are, lonely or excited or desolate, curious? And then how should we play it so we're really ready for the Dvorak by getting the feeling of lonely or whatever the words were? How can we play it so we're not just going through the mechanics? And then hearing some of those ideas and actually committing to trying them out. Now, if you could go to the next slide, Pedro, please. What we had hoped to ask you to do is just to use the chat box really quickly to respond to that second example. So how is the second warm-up a different kind of choice than the first? What kinds of choices are you making as a student? And we were interested in hearing some of your responses.
Let me start reading them out loud, just like Penny. Goal-oriented, says Penny. Kayla says it is making a connection, an application. Penny, in the service of the musical idea. Carolina, it is an analytical choice that promotes association, empathy, aesthetic appreciation. Ashley, it engages the imagination and makes the activity their own. Mm-hmm. Rebecca, connecting to the social emotional life of the student and music. Kayla, it isn't just a yes or no / a vote, but letting them self-express and hear other perspectives, attaches emotions to music. Abigail, links directly to the following activity for great expression and flow.
Great, beautiful. Yeah, the beautiful responses, and I'm sure more are coming in. And I even recognize some of those responses as some of the attributes that Denny introduced us to at the beginning: the emotion, the meaning making, and it's tying us so much more closely to the piece right, that we're about to join together. Somebody wrote ownership, I think, in your response as well, and that was something that came up as well when you were first in the chat box speaking about agency. So I guess the hope is that these choices, these small choices that keep adding up, that are asking students to make decisions about things that matter, about their emotional life, about choices that are authentically choices that musicians have to make, instead of just off the cuff choices, that the series of those smaller choices adds up to much larger and significant choices in their lives, and that they're able to, I think it was Harvey that asked at the beginning about voting, and I was really thinking about that. If you have a lot of practice over and over again, making significant choices, choices that matter to you or that matter to the music, then you're going to be much more practiced at making choices that are significant in other areas of your life. So I love that you asked that question. Before I go on to the next one, I just want to toss this out as a rhetorical question, not one that we might chat about in the chat box, but as we've all been dealing with this corona situation, and many of us are finding ourselves teaching online, using the internet, when our students, of course, have access to those kinds of things. I've been mulling in my mind how we continue to ask for significant choices, even as the medium changes. And I don't know, that might be something people are interested in talking about at the end, or just something to ask yourself as your sort of medium of teaching begins to change. Okay, Pedro, the next slide is the next idea I'd like to talk about as a building block of practice, and it's this notion of growth mindset. And I'll start by saying that Denny and I, along with our colleague Stephen Holocaust at Wolf Brown, we have done some research together that highlighted this potential of music learning. So we studied about 500 music students aged 8 to 11 in after-school orchestra programs here in the US that served neighborhoods of need and primarily of poverty. And it was a mix of cities and small towns and a large number of children. And we were looking at musical growth as well as socio-emotional growth. And one of those aspects that we explored was growth mindset. And we found a host of interesting things really throughout the study. But growth mindset rose right to the top of what we thought was really interesting. Now, what is growth mindset? Because that's an educational term that we speak a lot about in the US, but not so much in music as in other areas of academic learning. But it's really relevant. So growth mindset is this notion that when students really believe they can learn and get smarter and get better, they are understanding that effort is what strengthens this ability to grow and get better. So because they associate change with effort, they're more willing to put into time and effort and commitment, which often can lead to higher achievement. So children with a growth mindset see their intelligence or their talent as something that can improve with effort and grow over time. In essence, they believe the harder they work at something, the better they get. And research has also shown that when dealing with setbacks, children that have a growth mindset orientation are more likely to view challenges as opportunities. That's in contrast to a fixed mindset, which is the belief that your intelligence or your ability is fixed or stable, that it's not going to change or improve with effort, and that can lead to a feeling of despair, because even when you're working hard, there's a belief that it's not going to matter in terms of improvement. It's also been shown that children with a fixed mindset, when they experience setbacks, they become more discouraged or disengaged or questioning, and they worry more. So in the next slide, Pedro, what we also know through the research is that you're not born with a growth or a fixed mindset, but life experiences really shape and foster this. And we, as teachers, but as teaching artists, as musicians, we're really in the business of shaping these kinds of experiences for our students. If you go to the next slide, Pedro, the next slide. Thanks. We looked at both musical growth mindset and academic growth mindset. And some of the interesting things we found were that after about 1 year in a program, the students' mindset towards music went up a very small amount. But after 2 years of persistence, there was a significant difference in how they viewed themselves. So the next slide sort of shows this as a graph. We were looking at comparison students, so students in the same neighborhoods and schools, but who were not involved in music. And you can see that in the gray bar, the comparison students and the first year students in the music program, the music students actually had a very slightly lower measure of growth mindset. But after they'd been in the program for 2 years, this mindset took a dramatic leap. Now, the interesting thing here is that this chart in particular is not showing growth mindset in music, but it's showing growth mindset towards academics. So again, getting back to that, the question about voting, that's a bit of a leap, but what we did begin to find evidence for was that when you experience growth mindset in a discipline such as music, there does seem to be the capacity to transfer this into other areas of your life. So the next slide, Pedro, please. This, I just titled it Hope because this is more of a personal statement now than a finding from the research. But what it tells us is that music programs can be very fertile grounds for fostering growth mindset, and that with consistency, and that's specifically defined in our study by 2 years of participation, but over time, the point is, children can begin to bring this kind of a mindset to other areas of their lives. So it gives me a lot of hope that we as music teaching artists can get more skillful at helping our students develop a growth mindset and helping our students become significant choice makers. And that these abilities to choose what matters, there is the capacity for them to transfer into other areas of their lives. So these important building blocks really are what develop a sense of agency and help children understand, or adults understand, that their effort and their actions and their choices make an actual difference. Lastly, in the next slide, I wanted to just bring up 2 simple ways, thinking about things that we all can do in our practice for us to chat a little bit about. And these are just ways to foster growth mindsets in our music teaching artists practice. And the first one, and probably the most widely written about in the literature on growth mindset, is this idea of acknowledging effort versus acknowledging success or talent. And that's often evident in the kind of feedback that we give. So, so just saying good job or well done, kind of over time, repeatedly, can feed into that fixed mindset of I'm good at it, or I'm okay at it, or I'm not so good at it. But when we switch to consistently giving feedback that emphasizes effort, sometimes by just small adjustments in our language, such as "that was so clearly more in tune than the last time I heard it, you must have practiced it a lot." Or the other examples that I list here, sometimes that small adjustment over time can really make a difference in our students' lives. So Pedro and I had a chat box question here for all of you. Given that in our current situation, we're using these new structures, often these online platforms, how can we accomplish this practice of feedback or acknowledging effort versus success or talent? What are some ways we can begin to work this notion into our practice during this time? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If you could craft a succinct response in the chat box, Pedro would be kind enough to read some to us.
And Iris is sharing an example, I think, here of how this can look like. Today, we created with my students and an actor a concert with Zoom. They had to choose the time, title, pieces to be performed, all within 40 minutes, within a 40-minute time frame, and then had to choose their app administrator. Time to become a cultural institution themselves. Great experiences for all the families.
So lots of choices, and the choices are embedded into the medium that you're using too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Julie, I want to be mindful of time. Why don't we move to the second?
Okay. Yep. This is the last one.
Okay.
So the other way that we know we can really nurture our students' sense of growth mindset is to model for them overcoming challenge. And I thought that this would be an interesting one to post today, since we're all in an incredibly challenging time. And this is, again, the research has shown, not our research in particular, but others, that when teachers can find real moments to incorporate their own experience to illustrate to students how they've had to sort of persevere or work through a challenge, that it makes a difference. Again, especially if this is repeated over time. So I listed some examples here, but again, wondered if in the way that you're now interacting with your students and your programs, if you are in these new structures, if you had any thoughts about how you might use a strategy such as this. And if there are any interesting ones, Pedro, that you can read them, or we can move on and sort of give people time to think about it and share at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Certainly a possibility.
Okay.
I don't see any comments coming in the chat box at the moment.
Okay.
We're nearing the end of the session, and I think I would like to open it up in case there are questions to either you, Janielle, or Denny. And Janielle and Denny, if you could come back by turning on your webcams, I think that would be great. In the meantime, we wanted to leave this under our webcams. It's a word cloud that Natalia made with your responses to what you thought agency was and why it was important in this time. And, you know, so far, I think in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, just to thank the three of you for walking us through how music composition and performances can contribute to making under-resourced mothers feel more empowered to express themselves and explore their experience of motherhood. And you can see there in the word cloud that these words were already in the attendees' minds before we shared any of these examples. Then in Janielle's case, how ensemble practice, performance, composition, and international touring are fostering dialogue, are fostering connection and empowerment in Afghan young women. And then zooming into the day-to-day reality of our practice as teaching artists through Judy's presentation to get a sense of how specifically we can foster a sense of agency in our students, how we can get them to make authentic choices, and how that may prepare them to make relevant decisions in other areas of life. I see that there are a couple of comments from Ashley. So thank you, Ashley, for posting that comment. Does anyone have questions before we wrap this session up? Question for Judy. Let me read this one to you, Judy. How do you handle a situation where a student does not want to make a decision? Perhaps they're very indecisive and become stressed by making a decision.
Really good question, really good question. And not knowing the particular student, sometimes the starting out small and working up to the more significant choices. So sometimes giving a range of a 1, 2, 3 choice so they don't feel under pressure to come up with their own, but keeping in mind you want to work from that place to more and more significant choices that are owned by the student, but just to start small. Also noticing things, asking students what they notice or feel are the beginnings of choices too. So that's sometimes an inviting place to start.
Thanks, Judy. We have reached the time, unfortunately. I would like to welcome Gosha to tell us what's next. And in the meantime, while she turns on her webcam, just to thank you again, Denny, Judy, Janiel, for putting this together, for your time and energy. We really appreciate it. Gosha, let's see.
Thank you, everybody. It was really interesting to listen to this discussion. Again, we didn't have enough time. I would like to invite you to our upcoming events. Tomorrow, something really useful for the COVID-19 times, the 21st Century Studio, virtual teaching with Mary Beth Brown, an expert from Ottawa Symphony. It will be moderated by Deborah Wanderley from São Paulo Symphony. And next week, we will meet on Wednesday with our peer support task force discussion. We will continue our conversations about mental health. This is happening on Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. EST. Next one is our webinar on Thursday, April 16th at 3 p.m. COVID-19 Research and Response Frontlines, a conversation with Dr. William Hazeltine. And one more thing for next week is Friday, 17th April, 3 p.m. In Doers We Trust, Frameworks for Music Entrepreneurs. This will be presented by Stanford Thompson from Credit Institute. I encourage you to take part in all our events, including task force discussions and webinars, and I really do hope to see you tomorrow and next week. Thank you. Have a great day. Have a great afternoon. Have a great evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everyone.